Have you ever stopped to think about how much information we have in a typical war game? We can see every enemy unit, every gun position, every tank, and often we can predict exactly where the opponent intends to go next. Real commanders would have given their right arm for that kind of intelligence. So today I want to talk about one of the most fascinating challenges in tactical wargaming. How do we recreate the uncertainty, confusion and surprises of real warfare through hidden deployment and concealed movement? One of the great advantages of tabletop wargaming is that it allows us to explore aspects of warfare that are often difficult to appreciate from books alone. We can experience the problems of command, the challenges of terrain and the limitations of technology. Yet there's one area where many games still provide players with information that real commanders simply never had. Most of us are accustomed to looking down at the battlefield from what can only be described as a helicopter view. We can see everything. We know where every enemy unit is located. We know where the gaps in the lines are. We know where the reserves are waiting. Even when scenarios introduce uncertainty, there's often far less of it than would have existed historically. Commanders often had only fragments of information about enemy units. Scouts might report a force moving in a particular direction, but by the time that information reached headquarters, the enemy could already be somewhere else entirely. Even the introduction of aerial reconnaissance did not magically solve the problem. Whether it was observation balloons over the First World War battlefields or aircraft flying reconnaissance missions during the Second World War, information was often incomplete and frequently out of date. Commanders were constantly making decisions based on assumptions, guesses, and sometimes little more than instinct. That uncertainty is what military historians refer to as the fog of war, and for many years my own gaming group, the Posties Rejects, have been enthusiastic supporters of trying to recreate at least some of it on the tabletop. It certainly doesn't feature in every game we play. There are plenty of occasions where simplicity and practicality win the day, but some of our most memorable games have involved hidden deployment, concealed movement, or in some other method of preventing players from knowing exactly what their opponents were doing. What's particularly interesting is that there's no single correct way to achieve this. Different periods, different scales and different gaming groups all have their own requirements. Some methods are wonderfully simple and need almost no extra preparation. Others only work with an umpire, multiple tables or a fair amount of record keeping. Each method has its strengths and its weaknesses. Perhaps the simplest method, and one that takes me right back to my earliest experiences of playing games beyond role-playing games, it is hidden deployment. Looking back now, it's funny how common it seemed at the time. Sadly, I don't have any photographs from those early battles, which is probably just as well considering the quality of our terrain and painted figures. Those were the days of school friends, improvised battlefields spread across living room floors. Now, one of the first war games that we regularly played was Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and hidden deployment featured in almost every battle we played. Our solution was beautifully low tech. We simply hung a large sheet across the middle of the battlefield while both sides deployed their armies. Neither player could see what the other was doing, and once deployment was complete, the sheet would be lifted away and both generals would finally discover what was waiting for them. And without fail, this would usually be followed by a significant amount of colourful language from both sides. One player would discover that their carefully positioned cavalry were facing a solid wall of spearmen. The other would realise that their artillery was nowhere near the enemy concentration they'd expected. Plans would immediately unravel. Emergency adjustments would be made, and the opening turns often became a frantic effort to reposition forces into something resembling a coherent battle line. And what strikes me now is how much more realistic those opening turns felt. Instead of executing a perfect battle plan, we were reacting to unexpected information. In other words, we were doing exactly what real commanders have to do. Now, many years later, Stuart used exactly the same technique in our Shed of War for several historical games. Sometimes the simpler solutions remain the best. Now, one of the memorable examples involved our First World War forces launching attacks under conditions of fog or darkness. The sheet across the table represented that lack of visibility between opposing forces. Neither side knew precisely where the enemy formations were until the screen was removed and visibility was effectively improved. An even more memorable game involved a British and Portuguese army facing the French being driven across the Pyrenees in September 1813. Both armies were probing towards one another across the landscape, shrouded in dense morning fog. To make matters even more interesting, we introduced a small element of random movement during the opening turns. Units could drift significantly off course to represent confusion and poor visibility in that foggy conditions, and the results were absolutely chaotic. Both armies spent the early part of the game just trying to figure out where their own troops were, let alone where the enemy might be. Brigades wandered off in unexpected directions, gaps appeared where none were intended, commanders suddenly found themselves facing threats from entirely unexpected quarters. By the time the fog lifted, neither side looked remotely like the battle plan that they'd envisaged before the game had actually begun. It was tremendous fun. What made it work was not historical precision in every detail, but the fact that it created uncertainty. Players were forced to adapt. They could not simply optimise every move because they lacked the information required to do so. Another method that the Rejects have used extensively are blinds. Now, this is probably my personal favourite approach because it strikes a nice balance between practicality and realism. For anyone unfamiliar with the concept, blinds are markers placed on the table representing possible units. A single blind might represent a battalion, a brigade, a scouting party, or sometimes absolutely nothing at all. Until the enemy gains sufficient visibility or reconnaissance, they only see the marker and not the actual troops it represents. Now, we've used this method particularly successfully in our French-Indian Wars games. Dense woodland terrain is ideal for concealed movement. Troops rarely had clear visibility over long distances, and commanders often had only vague ideas about enemy locations. The beauty of blinds is that they introduce more than just uncertainty. They also create opportunities for deception. That marker moving through the woods could represent a powerful warband preparing an ambush. It might represent a tiny scouting force. It could even be an empty dummy marker designed purely to distract attention. Players begin second-guessing themselves. Every decision carries an element of risk. Should you commit reserves to counter a possible threat? Should you divert troops to investigate suspicious movement? Should you ignore it and hope for the best? Those questions are exactly what make blinds so enjoyable to play with and so engaging. Now, unlike hidden deployment behind a physical screen, blinds allow uncertainty to continue throughout the battle. The fog of war becomes an active part of the game rather than something limited to just the beginning. And while hidden deployment and blinds are methods that we've used regularly, there are also several approaches that we've never really tried ourselves. Perhaps the most famous is the double blind system. Now, this is often associated with traditional Kriegspiel style gaming. In a double blind game, neither player can see the enemy forces directly. Each side usually has its own map or a table. An umpire tracks movement and determines when opposing units come into line of sight. Only then are enemy forces revealed. Now, the advantages are obvious. In theory, this provides an exceptionally realistic simulation of battlefield uncertainty. Players only know what their commanders would reasonably know. Reconnaissance becomes critically important. Screening forces suddenly have a genuine purpose. Surprise becomes possible in a way that is difficult to achieve in conventional tabletop games. The downside, of course, is practicality. For a gaming group like ours, organising a full double-blind game would be challenging to say the least. You need space, time, and most importantly, an umpire willing to do a fair amount of work. Not every group has access to those resources. However, I could easily see it working well in a club environment. Imagine two separate tables located at opposite ends of the hall. Players issue movement orders to an umpire who updates a master map. As forces approach one another, contact reports begin filtering through. Eventually, the enemy comes into sight and the action transitions onto a shared tabletop battlefield. That could make for an absolutely fascinating event game. Whether you could fit that into a typical club evening is another matter, of course. Now, a variation on this idea might be even more practical. Instead of representing individual units on the hidden maps, players could move blocks, counters or markers representing large formations such as brigades or regiments. The exact composition of those formations remains unknown until contact occurs. Once the umpire determines that opposing forces have entered line of sight, the positions become fixed and the actual miniatures are deployed on the main tabletop. A bit like the deployment zone movement at the beginning of Chain of Command. At that point, the game transitions from operational manoeuvre into tactical combat. Now, this hybrid approach might offer many of the benefits of double-blind gaming without requiring players to spend an entire day moving invisible units around a map. There are also some modern alternatives worth considering. Technology opens up interesting possibilities. Shared digital maps, messaging apps and even simple spreadsheets can allow players to track hidden movement without requiring a large physical setup. Some groups use laptops or tablets to manage concealed information, others rely on text messages from an umpire. Now, while I personally enjoy the tactile nature of a traditional tabletop gaming, there's no denying that modern technology can make hidden movement systems much easier to manage. Another possibility is the use of written orders combined with delayed information. Rather than hiding units entirely, players might receive incomplete or outdated reports about enemy positions. This can be particularly effective for 19th century and early 20th century warfare. Instead of knowing exactly where an enemy brigade is located, a player might receive a report stating that it was observed near a particular crossroads 30 minutes ago. Whether it's still there becomes another question entirely. One member of our group ran a series of Vietnam games some years ago where opposing players wrote unit movement on a plastic grid overlaid over the map. In dense jungle, the figures were only placed once visibility was achieved and the enemy had been detected. What all of these systems have in common is that they challenge one of the assumptions that underpins many tabletop games. They force players to make decisions without perfect information. That can sometimes be uncomfortable. We're accustomed to knowing everything. We like certainty. We enjoy planning with complete awareness of the battlefield situation. Hidden movement takes that comfort away, yet it also creates some of the most memorable moments in gaming. The surprise cavalry charge emerging from unexpected terrain, the reserve force that arrives precisely where it's needed, or not as the case may be, the enemy formation that turns out to be much weaker than feared, the terrifying moment when a harmless looking blind suddenly reveals an overwhelming force. Those moments generate stories, and you know from some of my earlier videos that I'm all about the stories. And if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that the games people remember are rarely the ones where everything went according to plan. The games that stick in the memory are the ones where confusion, uncertainty, mistakes and unexpected events combine to create something unique. Fog of War helps create exactly those kinds of experiences. Whether you prefer a simple bedsheet down the middle of the table, concealed deployment, blinds moving through forests, or a fully umpired double-blind Kriegspiel, each method offers a way to make our tabletop battlefields feel just a little bit more like the real thing. Not necessarily more realistic in terms of detail, but definitely more uncertain, more suspenseful, and often a lot more entertaining. So what do you think? Have you used hidden deployment, concealed movement, blinds, double-blind systems, or any other method to simulate fog of war in your games? Which approaches worked well for you, and perhaps more importantly, which didn't? I'd love to know if you think uncertainty improves the tabletop experience, or do you feel it simply slows things down? As always, I'd love to hear about your own experiences, favourite systems and memorable gaming disasters in the comments below. That's it for this week. Please join the chat in the comments and don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell for your weekly fix. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course, keep rolling high. And as if on cue, the neighbours start mowing the lawns. How don't they know I have a filming schedule? Both armies were probing towards one another across a landscape. Landscape? What the hell's that word? I've been inventing new words in the heat.